This is breakout on climate crisis and energy. I'm Marty Gibbons, the issue chair, and we're going to talk about league positions, why we address climate change, who's on the team, Washington state legislative and regulatory status, outlook for continuing legislative action, and your opportunities for action. You can type questions in the chat as they arise to you, so you don't forget them, or write them down and ask them at the end. Doesn't matter. Phyllis Farrell has volunteered to keep track of the questions that are in the chat. And first, I'd like to stipulate that the climate change science is settled, and there's really no realistic quibbling about that. There's uncertainty, as there always is in science, and science will be, frankly, they'll be conservative until they know better. It's a global problem, and some regions have benefited more than others from the use of fossil fuel in creating and supporting their economy, and therefore have more responsibility. Every region must do their part. We can't just wait for the whole globe, and we can delay no longer. So why the League advocates for climate policies? Because the League formally believes that the climate change is a serious threat facing our nation and the planet. And all these aspects will help build it, and they require, or help address it, and they will require a public policy to follow through. And we pursue climate goals and policies that are consistent with the best available science we have right now. And the science that indicates what to do to ensure stable climate in the near term and for future generations. By the near term, I mean 20 or 30 years. By to stabilize this climate. And individuals, communities, governments must continue to address this issue at the local, state, regional, national, and global levels. The way we're addressing it, we're talking today, is about at the state level. And this statement, this is really an excerpt and bulletized, was approved by the U.S. board at the January 2019 meeting. So that explains partly why the League is taking this on. We actually have positions on climate change as well. That was more of a statement, but these are positions. We support legislation to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels and towards more efficient energy standards, including, of course, renewable energy, which fits in that category. We also support, investment in renewable energy and addressing the long-term impact of climate change, because it is creating flooding even in this country, and increasing the severity of some storms, doing some other things that happen right here in Washington as well. So we have to not only mitigate, but we have to adapt to what's going to happen. And we also support a price on carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions for that matter, whether cap and trade, which is what the Climate Commitment Act is about, carbon tax or fee, or other variable or viable, rather, pricing mechanisms. These are contained in our document, Program in Action, and the U.S. League's Impact on Issues, which those documents are available at that link. Who's on the climate team? I'm the issue chair, and have been for, this will be my 4th session on climate. Phyllis Farrell is now an advocate. She was the previous issue chair on climate. And Mary Moore is returning to support the lobby team. She was the coordinator for the Green Team and the environmental issue chairs in the past. Climate change in Washington. What are the effects we have here? Cascade Mountain glaciers are receding. snowpack is melting faster in the spring. For instance, last year we had greater than normal snowpack in February or March, and then by April it was diminishing below level, below normal, and it was draining down our streams already, so not available in the summer. Annual mean temperature is rising, and that's mean temperature, and it's what the trend is showing. And the result of some of these things is lower stream flows in the summer, which affect our fish populations and fish health. And so the state does their best to track where the greenhouse gas sources are coming from, and therefore that's what we need to address whenever possible. Transportation is our biggest chunk right now. These are 2019 numbers, unfortunately, now approaching 4 years old or 5 years old soon. And that's because they come from collected statistics at the national levels, what the state uses for this overall perspective. So unfortunately, they're kind of stale right now, but close enough, I think. Electricity is not is big, of course, but there's a plan to diminish that. And that occurred really in 2019. In 2021, the focus was on transportation with the Climate Commitment Act and the Clean Fuels bills. And in 2022, there was a bigger focus on buildings, residential and commercial, to get fuel use and embodied carbon out of new construction primarily. And then in 2023, there's focus, I'll start from the bottom, electrification of buildings we already have and new buildings, investing the Climate Commitment Act revenue well, and implementation, which we were just talking about in the big room, making sure we implement these bills that were passed. And that is a tough problem, because one must attend regulatory meetings and that sort of thing, and follow the regulation and being created. And it takes a lot of tenacity and people to do that. That's one look at our recent history. Here's a maybe more specific look. 2019, we had the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which eliminates greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, from our electricity sources by 2020, but also methane, because there's leakage in the methane. Using natural gas as a energy source for electricity generation does have, just beyond the carbon dioxide, methane leaks. And then we amended the state greenhouse gas emission limits, and I'll show that on a chart in a minute. And it aligns with what we understand with current climate science, what we knew in 2020, what we needed to get down to. And it includes requiring to get to net zero by 2050, which net zero means we're allowed to offset a certain amount that is very difficult to eliminate altogether by 2050. But ultimately, we have to get to releasing no human-caused greenhouse gases eventually. Clean Fuel Standard passed in 2021 to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. This is a big problem, especially for airplane travel and even some other high intensity uses for fuel or needs. The Climate Commitment Act was also 2021. We talked about that quite a bit. Allowance sales are underway, and $1.5 billion in receipts so far. It started in the Climate Commitment Act. Allowance sales started in January, and $1.5 billion in receipts. Now, what to do about those? And reducing greenhouse gas in buildings, both in fuels use and embodied carbon there. And one of the significant things in 2022 was ensuring that apartment buildings, multifamily housing down to 20,000 square feet was covered by electric only utilities. And that's all feasible, especially with modern systems such as heat pumps and induction ranges. I love my induction single burner range. I use it all the time, or single burner, just one heater, but it's great. And then we also in 2022 worked a lot on reducing methane emissions in landfills, and leakage of methane is a big deal because methane, as probably everybody here knows, is at least in the short term 80 times greater greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, although it breaks down faster, but it takes decades to break down. And then encouraging more community solar projects in 2022 also. And community solar, you know, is when a group of people get together, they can't put solar panels on the roof perhaps, and so they figure out a way to pool their resource and install a small solar installation that they can all benefit from. Everybody should be able to benefit from cheap solar energy. And in 2023, we improved the electrical power system transmission planning. In other words, put some effort into figuring out how much electricity power we're going to need to install more EV charging stations to cover the increase in heat pumps and water heat pumps, other sources of electricity as we replace the methane systems we have now. And actually, as you know, we grow, we talked about Denny Heck talked about the requiring 1 million more housing units in the next decade, and it'd be great if we could make those all electric and supply those housing units with reliable electricity. And then another bill was to streamline siting of clean energy projects, and that's consolidate all the hearings and approvals that are required to cite one of these, so it doesn't take years and years and years, and we can and the investors can have more confidence that they will be approved. Creating a Washington Climate Corps, and that is to train young people out of high school, maybe with a few years of college, to work in the renewable energy industry and related in electrification industry, because we're going to need more of those workers. They should be good jobs, and it's program piggybacking on some other training programs to focus on those skills. That was passed in 2023. And then also a crucial bill to update the state's planning framework, and what that refers to is part of the Growth Management Act, the requirements in the I'm grasping for the term, the comprehensive plan that counties and cities need to update periodically, and many of those are due for update this coming year. And so it requires more attention to anticipating the effects of climate change and to mitigate what they can by investing in low carbon, low greenhouse gas intensity systems and frameworks. What I just said, I guess, mitigation and resiliency, because we have a lot of climate change yet to come, already baked in, and we just need to pinch this off in future decades, but we've got to start now. So this shows the effect of some of those bills that were passed, and certainly the big swingers. Starting towards the left, the red line going down is the limits that the state has set itself for greenhouse gas emissions. So it's, of course, it's not just carbon dioxide. It's well, like methane is what I just talked about, but that bill was passed. It's House Bill 2311, passed in 2020. So these are what we're going after. And the bar shows how much what we passed, and in the red bar, what we have yet to pass to get to 2030. And that bar over 2030 is expanded on the right side with starting at the bottom, the Climate Commitment Act. Is estimated to reduce by 2030 annually 26 million metric tons of greenhouse gas release. That's, of course, the big chunk. It's half of what we needed, or more than half. It's more than half. We just need about 52 million tons to get to 2030 goals. Clean Fuel Standard does a little bit. The Clean Energy Transformation Act, it removes carbon from our electricity sources, is another big part. And then there are some small parts. This is the hydrofluorocarbon reductions. Hydrofluorocarbons are used in current or recent refrigeration systems, such as heat pumps, and new ones must have alternatives to hydrofluorocarbons. And it's that when they leak out, they're not greenhouse gases. Then there are other reductions that come along from good policy and environmental policy. However, unaccounted for is over 8 million metric tons, and we need to get that out to see our goal achieved by 2030. And of course, that's just the beginning. By 2040, we need to add some more bills and make that stack up even longer. And then we need to add some more bills by 2050 to make this stack up even longer to get down from where we were in 1990. As recently as 2018, we were substantially above the 1990 levels. So not a good trend exactly. That's our challenge right there. However, we are addressing the challenge. It is possible. We still have to follow through with all these, as we've been talking about too. If the Climate Commitment Act is overturned by referendum or initiative, in this case, not record, but that we are in a real big problem at that stage, because more than half of what we accomplish goes away. So I hope you can see that this is a challenge. So in 2024, we have 2023 bills that didn't pass that are still available. And this is available for passing. This is a priority of the Environmental Priorities Coalition, of which we are a member, and which we will support their efforts. That it's essentially buses purchased after 2027 must be zero emission. And it could be hydrogen powered, but hydrogen powering is technology that's not quite ready yet. So it's going to be battery electric buses. The original language in the 2023 bill was to have all buses operated, school buses that we're talking about, operated in the state be zero emission. But there's talk of increasing that by a couple of years. So school zones that have invested in buses this year say don't have to dispose of those buses, don't have to retire them, because that might not really make sense either. Funding, in part, would come from the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. And even though this bill didn't pass, there was a budget proviso of $60 million to help schools to afford this investment. They can get started right now, It just won't be, there's nothing required yet. But they can get started, and because there are benefits, if you can make the initial investment, it will pay off. Reducing greenhouse gases for one. There's almost zero pollution from these as they operate. So the air around schools and through neighborhoods where children drop off and get on buses is cleaner. And ultimately reduced operating costs after you make the investment anyway. And there's one other possible benefit. Some of these electric buses can serve as mobile power stations in the case of an energy outage, an extended energy outage, so people can do some recharging, or they can power a community building of some kind with the huge battery that's going to be in these buses. And I understand lithium-ion battery acquisition is going to be a challenge for many of these electrification objectives. And it is targeting overburdened communities for initial funding because they bear the brunt of a lot of the pollution from diesel buses right now because of the more densely populated their communities tend to be. And then more outlook for 2024. There was an Energy Upgrade Navigator program offered in 2023. It still, I think, is worthwhile. And it provides guidance for all the myriad of energy efficiency improvements someone can make on their house or systems they could buy, and how to get those funded by the available money, both from the state and the federal government. And it's, it's a lot of information. It'd be very hard for even me to sort through that on my own, just going through the web pages and trying to figure out what was true and what may not be true. It is aimed at helping overburdened and low-income communities because they have probably the least sophistication and time to sort these things out. Also covering, besides residences, small businesses that also may not have the wherewithal to sort out all the options and all the how to qualify for the grants and support. And but what it does is it allows retrofit of current residences and buildings with more energy efficient appliances and even insulation and repairs to make their buildings less leaky, more efficient, make other indoor air quality improvements. One of those can be switching from open flame propane or methane cooktops into electric induction. That reduces quite a bit of known indoor air quality pollutants, and children would be highly benefited by that. And I think there's a certain amount of medical evidence that's showing that to be the truth. It also, this navigator helps the contractors identify potential resources for their customers and ensures they comply with all the requirements so everybody can get their money and get paid. And funding for this is just the navigator. It isn't, I'm talking about I'm not talking about the actual money. This is for funding, actually bringing a navigator into fruition. So that funding from the Climate Commitment Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. There was a budget proviso in 2023, even though the bill didn't pass. A proviso was added to the budget to begin development of the database. And so we may be ready to go when the bill passes. There'll also be capability in this navigator to collect data to figure out where process clarity is lacking and where barriers exist to following through the process, so we can actually get some change done. the current bill sponsor, or one of the sponsors, anticipates that when this bill goes back into committee in this upcoming session, they'll probably replace the language with a substitute bill, and it largely will be the same, but he said it could use some language clarity improvements and organization to just make it a bit easier to digest. So, and it is a climate justice focus because of the targeting of overburdened and low income communities. Some more policy areas for 2024. Addressing fuel prices. That's part of the Climate Commitment Act, or objections to the Climate Commitment Act, because of especially high gasoline prices. Gasoline prices are, of course, the most visible of all energy pricing, because every street corner practically has a big sign on how much the energy costs. So this new policy would increase the pricing transparency. We collect data to show the sources for fuel cost increases and fuel price increases, and it may serve to control excessive fuel company profits. But challenges on some of these are states can't really regulate interstate commerce. We import practically all our petroleum, even though we refine a lot of it here west of the Cascades. But we think, collect and analyze the company information that would be available, it wouldn't be proprietary, and to show how the prices, what's driving the prices, and maybe that will control or slow down the price increases because of the increased scrutiny. And as I said, proprietary information would have to be protected in this context, as it always is on these things. And we expect the Senate to maybe introduce two bills on this to do two different things. And it is another priority for the Environmental Produce Coalition, along with the school buses. And Climate Solutions is the lead organization on this one. And so they will produce a lot of supporting documentation and also organize some action alerts such as that. And we'll try to make use of what they do as well. Carrying on, unpassed bills, of course, increasing energy efficiency in housing. This is where the grants come in to actually follow through with the increase in efficiency. And it's once again targeting our most at-risk communities. Funding from the usual sources. And this is what the Climate Commitment Act was intended to do, was to enable more investment in our overburdened communities and lower income communities that just don't have the resources to make these investments that will eventually pay off in the run. Then fair access to community solar and distributed electricity generation is a challenge for the electrical distribution systems such as Seattle City Light and Puget Sound Energy, but it's workable with modern computing and sensing systems. So this is to ensure that community solar, in other words, solar farms that are invested in a community, and so everybody in the community gets the benefit, ensure they can be sufficient size to make sense, and so it revises the size and operating limitations on those projects to encourage that. And then there's a bill known as CR Pacer. In this case, there was a C Pacer earlier, couple of years ago, Property Assessed Clean Energy Resiliency, and it is essentially allows a investment in a major energy upgrade, such as solar panels and a battery, and borrow money to install that, so purchase and install it, and then have that lien attached to the property. So the obligation, the repayment obligation, remains with the property rather than with the person who actually added it to the house. That means they could sell the house and wouldn't have to pay off instantly pay off the loan. The benefit to the purchaser is they would get ultimately a lower electrical energy bill monthly, and that extra money, unspent money, would go to pay the extra mortgage that they have to make. And the expectation is the net would be less. So they'd be the whole thing would enable cheaper energy for a homeowner and reduce overall payment on both house and utility. Here are some other bills that are being can be reconsidered. Extreme Weather Response Grant Program is for small cities to ensure they can respond to increased weather actions such as floods or heat domes, and perhaps it allows them, a grant would allow them to install a cooling center in an existing building, City Hall or some other building they have. 1480 is there was a bill that passed last session to evaluate the risk of relying on renewable energy, such as wind turbines and solar panels, but it was just focused on those two things. This bill that didn't pass, I think, focused on the risk of more things that are also potentially a problem. Energy resilience, in other words, can you the more sources for our energy will make the resilience of the whole system a little better, and or maybe a lot better, and not having to rely on just one or two sources for our energy. Cybersecurity, I think, is an increasing risk to our utilities. Just, I think, the last week there was an attack on a water system. I forget where that was, but there have been attacks on electrical systems. Washington State had a couple of those last year, or within the last 12 months, and any other hazards and emergency management. So I think that is looking forward, looking to the future on what could happen. I was disappointed that didn't pass. And then effort to minimize embodied carbon emission in state-funded projects. And embodied carbon is the what is essentially embedded in building a building. You know, how much carbon was released in making the product, bringing it to the site, and assembly. And so it's a database to try to minimize that. I talked about that a little bit, I think, in the between breakout sessions. And Environmental Prayers Coalition we're part of that. They are also focused on Climate Commitment Act adjustments to make sure we spend the $1.6 billion we've revenue this year in proper investments. There is very specific language on where the money is supposed to go. One of the big areas of interest is to overburdened communities, to help correct the environmental injustice, and to ensure they keep working towards reducing greenhouse gases and air pollution, improving environmental justice, and going to rural communities and tribes, making sure that happens. And possibly a change would involve, I talked about that before, fuel profiteering that some people are accusing petroleum industries are doing. And we need to continue attention on a healthy environment in general, and ensure the Clean Energy Transformation Act again was to reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas releases from our electrical generation systems, and oppose utility backsliding. We have to do this. This is part of, once we pass the bill, we have to follow up, because people will try to dodge it. Those affected by it will do everything they can to not be affected. And part of that is also building code regulation. We had some building code changes, but it wasn't legislated, so they were challenged in court, building codes to encourage or require more electrification. And they're being challenged in court now, so the best thing would be to legislate them through. And then, for those of you who remember long ago, Eric Hurst sued the state because aquifers were diminishing in Whatcom County, and it was they had to rethink how we install wells in overall the whole state, really, or much of the state. So that may require some adjustments too. And I don't have insight right now on what those adjustments might be. And we are members of both the Environmental Frontiers Coalition and the Northwest Energy Coalition. We get a lot of insight from them on why they are supporting or opposing bills. And we decide for ourselves, of course, but they do have a lot of good information, and we rely on that. Challenges, there will just opposition in general to new energy generation, such as solar panels and wind turbines. That's going on right now, but often with community outreach, that can be taken care of or handled, and with everybody's interest in taking into account. Heritage industries, such as the timber industry, is going to be affected by a lot of policies. We have to keep those in mind, that the workers there have to be taken care of, and their communities with some alternatives. People are discomforted with energy prices, especially right now, and blame is going around. And then the other thing recognized nationally is some areas that have a lot of wind, have a lot of sun, will have excess generation capacity, and we're going to need to move that electricity around with new transmission routes. And permitting those is a decades long, sometimes, or a decade long process, because the permitting is often goes county by county. And so there's a lot of hoops to jump through. And then a general desire to delay policies and regulations, because now is not a good time to do that for one reason or another, but we are out of time. And related issues, we talked about that in the open session a little bit. The waste handling issue also affects climate and vice versa. Methane in landfill, pipeline leakage, plastics and packaging, we talked about that. Recycling is a big challenge, because much of the plastic we use is just barely, it's not economically recyclable. And even though they have the chasing arrows implying it's recyclable, it may not be really. So that's a challenge. Forests can provide a lot of carbon sink. Land use and housing, and avoid planning housing for integration with transit can help quite a bit, and preserve the wild areas and the mature forests we have. Good transportation system, And much of this all has a health impact of improving health or eliminating degradation to health. And of course, it relies on revenue. Everyone can take action here. Express your concerns to your legislators. You don't have to wait for a bill to come out. You have concerns, tell them about it. If they don't hear from us, they'll hear from somebody else. And this is just links to, if someone needs to know where do I go to find my legislator, my senator, or the governor. Those are them. I anticipate this, a PDF of this slide deck will be on the league web page, and so you can return to that and get to the links that way. Express your concerns and support for things going on in your city and county as well. That's also important. There's the new comprehensive planning requirements from the revised GMA, and urge your county council members to take that seriously and focus on that, because it's going to matter to us. And you can keep up to date with things going on in the state and with the state with our local leagues when they have a program and our climate radar. If you're not already a subscriber, send me a note and I'll subscribe you to that. And of course, respond to action alerts and the legislative action letter. And we can all add our energy to making policy change. And finally, don't give up. We don't need to convince all the climate deniers. We just need to convince the people that already want to take action but don't know what to do, and or maybe are discouraged. We don't need to understand every detail or nuance to write our legislators, and every 1/10 of a degree will make a difference. Tell your friends and family what you're doing and how you're doing it and what you think about this. And tell your representatives, county council, state legislature, Congress, and don't give up. Okay, so here's also a list of messages that the legislators might be useful. Tell your legislator if you want to just get going on this. I once again I encourage you, just write those guys and women. The more they receive, the more interest they get from their constituents, the more they will attend to the bills. You can write them at any time. That just shows how to get there. And also, you can find your district. The league has information who represents you, those pamphlets that come out. Okay, now, the good part of the show. What questions or what else should we be doing? And Ann Bickle has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay then. Yeah, thank you. That was a very detailed and thorough presentation of what's happening right now in the environmental things. But one thing that's always puzzled me about our location here on the beautiful Sound, that we don't have tide energy in our formula as enormous source of energy.
Yeah, I think tide energy is a bit of a challenge. So the researchers are working through that challenge. Do you know of a place that's making regular use of tide energy?
I could check on it because I've lived in a lot of different countries. And I should tell you something very interesting about Switzerland. They had a terrible problem with the river Aare being terribly polluted with human waste. And so in the 60s, the middle 60s, they built a human waste disposable area, and they have a large fermenter with it. And the fermenter produces some kind of gas, propane or methane, and they run all the buses in the entire canton on the shit from people in the city.
Wow.
Yeah, and you know, that is not necessarily excess carbon because it's carbon that comes out and it's carbon that is produced. It's not like you're releasing carbon that's millions of years old.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It would come out as methane, which would be worse than carbon dioxide right now.
Yeah, it comes out as methane. Is it propane? It might be methane.
It's probably methane. Propane, well, I think
It
there's,
probably isn't propane, it's probably methane. Now, the other thing is in many countries, the landfills have pipes coming out and the methane produced is used for heating.
yes. And a couple of years ago, there were a couple of bills passed to address the landfill methane problem in Washington
Yeah.
State. Now, it limited it to large landfills, not small ones. And also another bill was to, and Ann talked about this a little bit, Ann Murphy, but a bill to divert more of the organic waste to what you just talked about, Ann, or our composting, depending on what the waste was.
Yeah.
You collect sewage and yard waste in a different stream, certainly, so they may be going to a different location. But it was trying to keep organic waste out of a landfill, which becomes an anaerobic, digester, creating methane. And you don't want that. If it's aerobically handled like compost, to create compost, it doesn't create methane. And,
No, compost is a wonderful thing. That's true, because it's just a recycling of it. I'll tell you one other thing. I lived in Finland for a while, and in Finland, they get their fresh water from a rather distant lake, and they run it by means of a stream, which is a very, very slow incline down to Helsinki. And they've got turbines all along it, and they light enormous areas with the energy from the turbines. Now, these are not giant dams or anything like that. They're very small turbines. They have collectively a lot of a result,
Yeah, and if it's the energy is from the total fall of the water, if it's thousands of feet, you can get quite a lot of energy out of a relatively small amount of water. Our dams in eastern Washington make use of the same thing,
I know, but it's a dam and it completely destroys the ecosystem.
Yeah, and there's usually never a completely eco-friendly source of energy. There's only a solar farm is covering up something, either farmland or
I know.
wild natural.
But you can grow your tomatoes under the solar powers, and you can grow your strawberries. You can grow a lot under
You
solar
gotta learn
panels.
to do that, certainly.
And you can also have them at an angle so dust doesn't collect on them, so they can be. I mean, we get a lot of wind.
Yeah, and rain for that matter.
Yeah.
And so, angles are usually used just to make sure they face into the sun, unless you're at the equator, then you angle them straight up. But getting back to, the tidal energy, I think in California, they're installing some of that, but it's possible we may use that. One I'm more interested in is geo energy, and that is
another beautiful. Yes,
that's because we are on volcanic ground here.
Absolutely.
And I'm talking about drilling down far enough to access the magma and get some 1,000+ degree, 1,500 degree energy out of there, and then you can really that's a big energy source. Ground source or lake source is also, a way to improve efficiency of heat pumps and such. But, what I'm talking about is really getting heat that can drive a steam turbine.
Go that deep. You don't have to go down to the magma. You can just go down actually not that far and you'll get a heat differential. That's all you need.
That's right. And I call that ground source, where it makes sense for small installations, certainly. But there's also the possibility here of accessing the really hot rock that gives us our volcanoes eventually. And
we don't want to create another fault line, do we?
No,
we do not want to create another
fault lines are
tectonic event.
Fault lines are huge. Now, having said that, they're talking about using fracking technology.
Fracking's terrible.
And fracking has created some problems, so we got to be careful.
Our liquid natural gas is all fracked.
Yes, a lot of it is. Yes, that's right.
They say that it's a link, that it's a clean product. It's no way near clean.
Yeah, that's right.
That's just greedy hands. That's all that is. Yeah. Anyhow, I'm going to stop talking. Let someone else talk. Okay.
Joanna Cullen.
So I was thinking it seems like maybe um, more funding for things that are actually geared toward individual buildings, like homes, like solar roofs or solar powered ability to do homes or geothermal, even in even larger buildings or in homes. And it seems like to me, it seems like there's not that easy of funding to access to do that in individual buildings. And then they build these large new buildings and are doing none of that.
Yeah, and some of that was in the bill I talked about. I don't know if I can find it here.
But I'm very frustrated with the big buildings that are going up that aren't doing any of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so to encourage them, we have to have, I'm gonna have to just see if I can find, I talked about it a little bit here.
I know there were some tax incentives and different things created for,
And so,
1391.
yeah, let's see, I'm thinking really what I was talking about was, I think up here, well, the Energy Upgrade Navigator, I think, even though it's targeted at overburdened and low-income communities, I think it would be available to identify where funding could be available to install some of this. Now, this is targeted at small buildings, houses and small businesses, not the big things. But one thing that was done was to require all electric multifamily buildings. Now it was down to 50,000 square feet. I don't know how many apartments would be in that, and now down to 20,000. But that does require it. I have talked to a contractor, an architect who works for a contractor, who said they're putting that's the primary business, is building those buildings, and they have no trouble installing the equipment or even getting the equipment they need, sourcing it. So it is too bad if a big building doesn't use that kind of thing. It seems like it needs to be somebody like the Gates Foundation, that worked hard to make their headquarters a green headquarters. You find occasionally.
I think that was the Bullock Foundation, not the Gates
The
Foundation.
Gates Foundation did it too.
Well, the Bullock Foundation is better.
Foundation, yeah. And let me see, there was about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a condo kind of community in Issaquah Highlands, I think it was, that did the ground source heating. They had to drill straight down because they had such a small footprint typically, but that's feasible too. But you got to make the investment, and you get the benefit over decades, and anybody trying to sell the units for the smallest possible price, the builder wants to sell the unit and keep his costs down, so that works against us. And therefore, being able to, that R-Pacer, being able to get a loan out and attach it to the building, and whoever gets the benefit over the years gets to pay the fee and keep the excess, keep the difference. So those are things that are happening, but you're right, Joanna, it's we could be doing so much more, and not spending our money wisely, or somebody's trying to take away the money.
And then Seattle said new buildings had to have electric heat, but they didn't want to give up those gas ranges.
Yeah, that's as I said earlier, I don't know, about a year ago, I bought, maybe more than that, a year and a half ago, I bought a single burner induction range, and that's all I use just about.
My husband got an induction range when we remodeled after using his single burner for quite some time.
Yeah, and I would love to have the 4-burner, but I mean, this is great. It cost me $80 and it cooks great. I can even put my wok on it. It even heats up a wok.
Yes, we remodeled after 30 years, we got a new stove, so that's when we took advantage of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And yeah, it's hard to replace something that's still working, something has useful life. And so it's a dilemma, certainly. Anita Rose is here, editor of our Climate Radar. What do you have, Anita? Anita,
Okay. I read something, I believe it was in the Times, the New York Times or Washington Post, but it was about how landlords are reluctant to invest in climate worthy, uh, windows and anything that helps with the climate because it's all that is paid for by the tenants. And so they don't have any kind of carrot to go for to upgrade leaky, windy kinds of housing units. And so many places are now uh, are rentals, especially like in big cities. So I wonder, is there any talk of addressing landlords and making it worth their while?
well, I think you got it right. A landlord is trying to minimize their cost. And if it costs more for their tenant, such as they would put in a cheap heating system, baseboard heating, for instance. Baseboard heating is not efficient, and because it's cheap to install it, and the tenant now has to pay the extra electro bill. The landlord doesn't have to pay it. The landlord saved cost by installing a cheap heating system and doesn't have to pay the outcome. And so the incentives are inverted a bit. Therefore, the only way I can think of, the way we're addressing it, let's put it that way, is building codes that require certain installations in large apartment buildings and trying to work those down lower and lower to get to duplexes eventually. And I also hear a couple times a year terrible stories about landlords that are allowing mold to go unabated in their units, and got a lot of problems with rental units, and this is one of them certainly. But as long as the incentives are inverted, it's going to be difficult without just outright regulation, I think. And because, well, it's the case of the heat pump. Heat pump will, once you've invested in it, it will reduce your monthly electricity bill by quite a lot, and also permit cooling in the summer if you really need it. It's not free cooling, but at least it's there. And so it seems like a better system in our climate changing outlook. But a landlord has little incentive to do that because the landlord isn't living in that unit, and the landlord is just paying to install something. So that I see as the dilemma. If Anita or anybody else can stumble across a scenario, a written up scenario on how you could correct that, finesse that problem, that would be great.
Marty, doesn't the C-Pacer and our Pacer bills kind of help address that?
To some extent, yes, and I'm not sure, you may know more about that than me, Phyllis, and that the C-Pacer or the R-Pacer I just described a few slides up is to be able to make an investment and then attach the loan to the building. And so whoever's paying the rent, or I think it's usually the owner of the building, pays the additional payment, but that's offset and more so by decreased monthly electricity costs. And therefore you're willing to do it. And then you're not, it's not a loss investment, because when you sell the house, that obligation goes with the house. And the next owner keeps paying off the loan to install that better system, but then gets the benefit from that better system. You know, and I think that seems like a good way to do it. I don't know how it works with a renter and a landlord, because unless you could somehow attach the payment to the renter's rent, I don't know.
I know it applies for like apartment buildings, commercial apartment buildings and
Yeah,
businesses,
That's
you know,
why-
that,
yeah. Well, you know, I think that, yeah, the new, see, our pacer and C-Pacer were for existing buildings, I think, really. And
right.
and so the halfway step that's been made is to require electrification of the large apartment buildings down to 20,000 square feet now. You know, so that with 20,000 square feet is what this 21,000 square foot units, or, you know, 1,200 square foot units or something. So it's not really very big. So, you know, we're getting down to making more of a difference now. Anyway,
I
something
put
else?
in the chat too.
Oh,
Do you know, are there efforts to restrict the use of propane, which is, you know, worse than natural gas
well,
in terms
yeah,
of it?
I don't know, and my house has propane. And I don't like it. For one thing, it's costly. And we have a heat pump because we're out in the country. You know, there's no gas, no methane service out here. So it's propane. The other thing, the previous owner installed a all house generator that can run all the systems when the electricity goes out. It used to go out 10, 20 years ago out here. It used to go out frequently for long periods of time. Anymore, the longest it's gone out, it goes out several times a year for several hours, maybe 6 hours, but that's not too bad. But if it was out for days, I'd love to have a generator. But anymore, it's only gone out 26 hours. It's the longest it's gone out since I've been here. So I'm thinking, well, I better have a battery and the solar panels on the roof, really. And I'd love to have our pacer to pay for that, you know, or a grant.
Mhm.
It's quite a big investment, but I think ultimately that's a better system.
Mhm.
And how do we make the investment, you know?
Mhm.
Um,
Something real quick, Marty, before we have to go, that something that everyone that can get involved with in their local jurisdiction is their comprehensive planning that's taking place right now in all the counties. And a bill 1181 that passed this year actually requires the consideration of climate change in their planning processes. So, but it's going to require local citizens' vigilance to make sure that that happens to the degree of the intent of the bill. So,
yeah. Yep, that's right. It's the bill passes, but that's just the first part. We just have to hold people accountable. Okay, we have about half a minute. Any last statements somebody'd like to make? Or encouragement to go do something a little different? Or focus on another, you had some recommendations. Thank you very much.
excellent presentation, Marty.
Okay, see you in the big room.